Summer 1943. A German prisoner of war sat in a dusty camp in Tennessee, staring at a small rectangle wrapped in brown paper. The heat of the southern sun softened its edges, a faint sheen glistening where chocolate threatened to melt. He had not tasted such sweetness since 1939, when the war was young and Germany's streets still pretended at prosperity. Now, in the heart of enemy territory, in a land he had been told was weak, starving, decadent, he was being handed a feast disguised as a ration. He unwrapped the bar slowly, as if afraid the vision would vanish, and when the first square touched his tongue, his world began to tilt. This was not the reception German soldiers had been promised. They had been told to expect chains, starvation, and humiliation at the hands of their captors. Their generals assured them that surrender to the Americans would be a sentence of misery. Propaganda painted the United States as a country of mongrel weakness, a society too soft to fight, too poor to provide for its own, let alone prisoners. And yet here, across thousands of miles of ocean, after months of brutal fighting in North Africa, they discovered a reality that shattered every expectation. Instead of stale crusts there was white bread. Instead of bitter substitute coffee there was steaming, fragrant real coffee. Instead of watery cabbage soup there was canned meat, processed cheese, chewing gum, and chocolate. For the men of Rommel's Afrika Korps, capture had come suddenly. After 2 years of desert warfare, dust storms, and hunger, they were forced into surrender at Tunisia. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were captured in that final campaign. Of these, thousands were shipped across the Atlantic under heavy guard, deposited in hastily built camps scattered across the American South and Midwest. The journey was surreal. They boarded ships as enemies of democracy, and stepped onto American soil as prisoners who could hear children laughing beyond the barbed wire, see farmers tending vast fields, and smell dinners drifting from nearby towns. The war was still raging in Europe, but in the United States life looked normal, abundant, untouched. The first shock arrived in the mess halls. German soldiers lined up, expecting gruel. They braced for humiliation, for scorn, for cruelty. Instead, guards handed them trays filled with items many had not seen in years. Fresh vegetables, white potatoes, slabs of meat, real butter. Some meals even included dessert, ice cream in summer, cakes on special occasions. And with each ration kit came unexpected treasures: cigarettes and chocolate, gum and candy bars. The American army considered these essentials of morale, small comforts for men at war. For the Germans, they were luxuries that bordered on the unbelievable. To understand the depth of this shock, one must remember what rations meant in wartime Europe. By 1943, German civilians were living on thin slices of bread, ersatz spreads made of ground-up beets, watery soups, and coffee substitutes brewed from roasted acorns or barley. Meat was rare, butter scarcer still, chocolate nearly mythical. Cigarettes, when available, were hoarded like gold, traded on the black market for outrageous sums. Soldiers in the Wehrmacht carried dry biscuits and thin sausage. Even frontline rations were grim shadows of the abundance they had known in peacetime. Hunger gnawed constantly at both civilians and troop. To them, food was survival stripped bare of luxury. And then came America. The K-ration, the standard field kit carried by every U.S. soldier, contained biscuits, canned cheese, powdered lemonade, a tin of Spam or ham and eggs, a fruit bar, and, always, a small block of chocolate, chewing gum, and a pack of cigarettes. To the Americans, these were the bare minimum. Soldiers grumbled about Spam, mocked the powdered drinks, and cursed the monotony of the meals. Many traded away their rations, longing for home cooking. But for the Germans who received these very same kits behind barbed wire, each package was nothing short of astonishing. Here was proof of a society so wealthy it could afford to feed prisoners better than Germany fed its own fighting men. At first, the prisoners eyed these gifts with suspicion. Could it be a trick? A means of softening them for interrogation? But the pattern repeated day after day. The cigarettes were real. The chocolate was sweet and smooth. The gum snapped between teeth with a flavor of mint that felt impossibly foreign. When one soldier unwrapped a Hershey bar, he whispered in disbelief, "It tastes of another world." Another recalled years later, "The first cigarette I lit in an American camp carried more meaning than any speech. It told me this country had riches we could not imagine." The propaganda of Joseph Goebbels had always leaned heavily on fear. He told Germans that the Allies were brutal, that capture meant starvation, that America was a land of chaos and poverty. But here in Tennessee, in Texas, in Nebraska, the reality stood in stark contrast. Prisoners ate 3 meals a day, often with more calories than they had known in months. They were issued cigarettes freely, the smoke curling like visible proof of American plenty. They were given chocolate bars that children in Germany might have dreamed of but rarely tasted. And when they looked around, they saw that American guards treated such luxuries as commonplace. Candy bars cost 5 cents at the canteen. Cigarettes could be bought in endless packs. To the Americans, these were trifles. To the Germans, they were treasures. The effect was disorienting. Many POWs had gone to war convinced of their nation's superiority, taught that the Third Reich was the pinnacle of modern power. Yet here they were, prisoners in a land where even enemies were fed with abundance. The abundance itself became a quiet weapon, undermining every lie they had been told. If the Americans were so weak, how could they afford such generosity? If they were so decadent, how could they fight with such force? If they were so poor, why did their camps feel like places of strange comfort compared to Europe's hunger? The bitterness of defeat was sharpened by this contrast. In Germany, families starved. In America, prisoners ate chocolate. One POW later wrote, "It was not the barbed wire that trapped us. It was the sight of plenty. We realized our leaders had lied. And that realization was harder to swallow than defeat itself. Defeat meant laying down arms. Chocolate meant questioning everything." The guards themselves were often oblivious to the impact of these rations. To them, a cigarette was nothing more than a smoke break, chocolate a small pleasure between duties. They laughed about Spam, joked about army coffee, and tossed candy to children outside the camp fences. They could not see how each gesture landed like a hammer blow on German pride. To men raised in scarcity, these casual acts displayed a wealth of resources and a casual generosity that defied imagination. Inside the camps, the rations became more than food. They became symbols, tokens of a larger truth. Cigarettes turned into currency, traded among prisoners for favors and services. Chocolate was hoarded, savored, treasured, sometimes mailed home in letters as proof of this strange American reality. When packages arrived in Germany containing candy or gum, families often refused to believe it. Surely this was propaganda in reverse. Surely America could not waste such riches on prisoners. And yet the truth lay wrapped in foil and brown paper. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock deepened into reflection. The prisoners began to talk among themselves. What did it mean that their captors shared luxuries, even as enemies? What did it reveal about a society that placed chocolate bars into ration kits, not as indulgence, but as necessity? Slowly, a realization seeped in. They were witnessing the power of an economy and a culture so different from their own that it might as well have been another planet. And in that realization, seeds were planted, seeds that would grow long after the war, shaping how many of these men viewed democracy, prosperity, and freedom. Yet for now, in 1943, they sat in camps behind wire fences, tasting chocolate, lighting cigarettes, and struggling to reconcile propaganda with reality. The bitter taste of defeat mingled with the sweet taste of American abundance. Every bite, every puff, told them that the world was larger and stranger than they had been taught. And as they lay on their bunks at night, wrappers crinkling softly in their pockets, one question haunted them. If this was only the beginning, what greater shocks awaited them still? The first sweetness of chocolate was enough to confuse the prisoners. But it was the steady curl of cigarette smoke that began to haunt them. In Europe, a cigarette was not simply tobacco wrapped in paper. It was wealth, it was power, it was relief from gnawing hunger and stress. It was the kind of item men would barter boots for, trade bread for, even risk their lives for. In 1943 Germany, one cigarette could grease the wheels of survival in a prison cell, purchase a favor from a guard, or buy warmth for a night. Cigarettes were treasure, the most sought-after currency in a collapsing society. And yet here, in the American prison camps scattered across the heartland, the Germans found themselves issued cigarettes in bulk, as casually as bread rolls. Each ration kit contained a small pack of them, often Lucky Strikes or Chesterfields, tucked neatly alongside biscuits and canned cheese. To American soldiers, these cigarettes were simply expected, one more necessity of life at war. To the German prisoners, they were astonishing, more valuable than coins, more meaningful than pay slips. They were tokens of a nation so wealthy it could hand out luxuries to enemies without a second thought. The arithmetic of abundance, as one prisoner later described it, could be measured in cigarettes. If a man smoked 2 a day and still had 8 left over, he was suddenly rich. In Germany, that surplus would have been unthinkable. The camps became miniature economies. Within days, cigarettes emerged as the dominant currency. A skilled tailor might mend a coat in exchange for 5. A talented cook might improve the bland rations for 2. A man with musical skills might sing for a cigarette or 2, and those with extra stock could hire labor or purchase small luxuries from others. The American guards seemed almost blind to the value of what they distributed. They would hand out cartons, flick cigarettes from their own packs, and occasionally toss extras to prisoners without much thought. To them it was nothing. To the prisoners it was a revelation of plenty. Candy, too, played its role. Each ration kit included small pieces of chewing gum or a candy bar, sometimes Hershey's, sometimes Tootsie Rolls, sometimes fruit-flavored lozenges. Many of these men had not seen such things since childhood. The gum especially carried a strange magic, snapping with mint or fruit flavors that seemed too artificial to be real. A German prisoner once recalled chewing a stick for hours, unable to bring himself to spit it out, convinced that if he did, the taste of America would be gone forever. Another sent wrappers home in letters, proof to his family that such abundance existed, though many relatives back in Germany thought it must be lies or exaggeration. The Germans began to study these rations like archaeologists uncovering a new civilization. They examined the labels on tins and wrappers, marveling at the bright fonts and playful logos. Even the packaging felt different, colorful, commercial, exuberant. American food seemed designed not only to feed but to delight. In Germany, packaging was plain, functional, stripped of ornament. Here, a Hershey's wrapper spoke of a society that cared about pleasure as much as survival. To men raised in austerity, this was a quiet but powerful education. Numbers tell part of the story. A typical American K-ration contained about 3,000 calories, enough to sustain a soldier in the field. It included cheese, meat, biscuits, chocolate, powdered drinks, gum, and cigarette. Compare that to a German soldier's ration. Perhaps 1,200 calories at the front, often less, supplemented by whatever could be scavenged. The contrast was staggering. Even as prisoners, the Germans consumed more calories and more variety than many of their comrades still fighting in Europe. And this abundance was routine. The American supply lines were vast, efficient, and seemingly endless. The prisoners did the math in their heads and realized, this was not a society on the verge of collapse. This was a nation so rich that even its enemies were well fed. The irony deepened when they overheard American guards complaining about these very rations. Soldiers muttered about the monotony of Spam, rolled their eyes at powdered lemonade, and joked about gum that lost its flavor too quickly. To them, it was tiresome fare, uninspired, barely tolerable. To the Germans, it was bounty. They savored each bite of Spam, salted and meaty, as if it were a delicacy. They treasured the gum long after its flavor faded, chewing for comfort rather than taste. They smoked each cigarette slowly, inhaling not just tobacco but the fragrance of a society that could afford such generosity. At night, the camps glowed faintly with cigarette tips in the darkness. Conversations rose softly over the fence lines, men trading stories, laughter, and the occasional cough from too much smoke. Some prisoners rationed their rations, saving chocolate for special moments, hoarding cigarettes as currency. Others indulged freely, as if tasting freedom itself in each puff and bite. But all of them felt the same underlying shock. America's abundance was rewriting the script of war. In Germany, propaganda had declared that the Allies starved their prisoners, that America was a land of breadlines and desperation. But the evidence before their eyes made those words ring hollow. Instead, they discovered a society that wasted food without thinking, that tossed candy bars to children as if they were pennies, that smoked cigarette after cigarette without fear of scarcity. One prisoner remembered watching an American guard light a cigarette, take only a few puffs, then flick it away half-finished. To the German, the sight was almost unbearable. He would have smoked every last shred down to the paper, yet the guard wasted it with casual ease. That single gesture carried more meaning than any military victory. It showed the immense gulf between the worlds they inhabited. Slowly, the prisoners began to internalize this arithmetic of abundance. Cigarettes were not merely smokes, they were proof of power. Candy was not simply sugar, it was evidence of wealth. Each wrapper, each puff, each stick of gum became a small revelation. And in that revelation lay the seeds of ideological collapse. If America could afford to waste what Germany treasured, then perhaps Germany was not destined for dominance. Perhaps the Reich was not invincible. Perhaps strength did not look like tanks and jackboots, but like a society that could manufacture millions of candy bars and hand them out to soldiers as casually as bread. The camps buzzed with quiet comparisons. "Do you remember the bread lines in Hamburg?" one prisoner would say. "Here, they feed us meat 3 times a week." "Back home, cigarettes are worth gold," another would reply. "Here, they give them away." The more they talked, the more the contrast weighed on them. America was not the weak, decadent enemy they had been taught to despise. It was something else entirely, an industrial giant, a land where even prisoners lived better than many civilians in Europe. Not every prisoner accepted this easily. Some clung to the propaganda, insisting it was all a trick, that the abundance was temporary, that the Americans meant to soften them before revealing cruelty. But as weeks turned into months, those doubts grew harder to sustain. The rations never faltered. The cigarettes kept coming. The candy never disappeared. Reality itself became the most persuasive argument, stronger than any leaflet or speech. And reality said that America was strong, wealthy, and, above all, confident enough to feed its enemies with kindness. Even humor found its place in this new economy. Germans joked among themselves that they would happily endure captivity if it meant a steady supply of chocolate and cigarette. They laughed at the absurdity of prisoners smoking better than generals back home. They teased each other about gaining weight in enemy camp. Beneath the laughter, though, was a quiet recognition they were experiencing something profound. When letters arrived from Germany, the gulf widened further. Families described shortages, hunger, endless queues for bread and potatoes. They begged for cigarettes, for chocolate, for anything that could be sent home. Prisoners sometimes mailed small packages of American goods, only to have their families refuse to believe them. One mother wrote back in disbelief, "You say they give you candy? That cannot be true. We hear the Americans starve you." The prisoners knew otherwise. They lived the contradiction every day. The arithmetic of abundance was not only physical, it was psychological. Each cigarette smoked, each candy bar consumed, was a subtraction from Nazi propaganda and an addition to a new worldview. The men began to wonder, if America treated its enemies with such generosity, what did it offer its own citizens? If prisoners lived this well, what must daily life be like outside the fences? Slowly, envy crept in, not only for the cigarettes but for the society that could produce them in such endless supply. By late 1943, the camps had settled into rhythms. Cigarettes remained the lifeblood of their economies, candy the sweet punctuation to each day. German prisoners were no longer surprised by the abundance, but they were still unsettled by its meaning. The shock had dulled, but the questions it raised grew sharper. Could a nation built on such comforts truly be defeated? Could a regime that promised scarcity ever compete with one that produced plenty? The answers lay beyond their reach, but the seeds of doubt had been planted deep. Chocolate and cigarettes were not weapons in any official arsenal, yet they proved more corrosive to ideology than bullet. Each puff of smoke, each square of chocolate, dissolved illusions and replaced them with visions of a world where abundance was ordinary. And yet, as much as the prisoners marveled, they had not yet seen the full measure of America's wealth. For all the cigarettes and candy bars, for all the spam and gum, there were still greater shocks waiting in the wings. Shocks that would not only reshape their appetites but transform their very sense of who held power in this war. In the quiet hum of the camp, where fences stretched like stitched seams across the American landscape, the prisoners began to notice not just what they were given but what was thrown away. A half-eaten sandwich abandoned on a plate, a chocolate bar bitten once and discarded, a cigarette stubbed out when half its length remained. To men shaped by scarcity, these sights were almost unbearable. They carried the weight of revelation. The Americans, it seemed, lived in such abundance that even waste was casual. What a German would have hoarded for days, an American cast aside without a second thought. At first, the prisoners reacted with envy, then with disbelief. One man stared at the trash bins behind the mess hall, filled with scraps of meat and bread, and muttered that in Hamburg such refuse would have been picked clean in minutes. Another, watching an American guard flick away a cigarette still glowing, clenched his fists in frustration. For these men, every crumb and curl of smoke had value. Yet in America, plenty was so ordinary that even prisoners lived surrounded by it. The arithmetic of abundance, which had begun with rations and cigarettes, now unfolded in full color. The guards did not appear cruel. They laughed, joked, smoked, and moved with an ease that contrasted sharply with the rigid discipline of the German army. They did their duty, but they did not grind it into the prisoners with hatred. Some even exchanged small words across the fences, gestures of humanity that shocked the men more than threats would have. "How are you today?" one guard asked in halting German. A prisoner, startled, replied automatically, "Gut." It was a brief moment, but it cracked open the possibility that enemies could also be men. In the evenings, the prisoners heard the faint strains of music from radios outside the camp. Jazz, swing, American folk songs, rhythms strange and lively, unlike the martial marches of the Reich. To some it felt like noise, chaotic and undisciplined. To others it sounded like freedom, like a society alive in ways they had been taught to despise. They began to see that prosperity was not only measured in food and cigarettes but in laughter, in music, in the casual ease of a people who had never felt bombs rain on their cities. Letters home deepened the contrast. Families in Germany described air raids, hunger, queues that stretched around blocks for scraps of food. They asked desperately for news, for comfort, for anything that could be sent. When prisoners wrote back that they had chocolate and cigarettes, many relatives could not believe it. Some assumed the men were mocking them or had been seduced by enemy lies. "You must be exaggerating," one mother wrote. "It cannot be true that they feed you so well. We hear the Americans torture their prisoners." Yet the truth was undeniable to those living it. The lie of Nazi propaganda collapsed each time a cigarette was lit, each time chocolate melted on the tongue. And still, the guards complained. They grumbled about spam, about coffee too weak or too strong, about the monotony of meals. To them, these rations were disappointing, uninspired. To the prisoners they were feast. That irony cut deep. The very items Americans cursed as inadequate were more than most Germans had seen in years. It was not just abundance, It was casual abundance, so secure that people could mock it. That mockery revealed something profound, a confidence so strong that even dissatisfaction was a luxury. Slowly, the prisoners began to look beyond the fences with different eyes. They saw American children playing with toys carved from wood and tin, eating candy bars without ceremony. They saw towns untouched by bombings, houses standing solid, farms stretching with corn and wheat. It seemed impossible. In Germany, ruins smoldered, cities groaned under air raids, and fear stalked every street. Here, even in war, life looked untouched. One prisoner whispered to another, "If this is how they lived during war, how must it be in peace?" The psychological transformation deepened with every passing week. The men who had once viewed America as a crude, mongrel nation began to see it as something else entirely, a civilization with a strength that did not need to boast. They saw power in excess, confidence in generosity, superiority in laughter and ease. They became witnesses of prosperity, unwilling at first, then fascinated. The image of America they had carried with them, weak, starving, chaotic, was erased with every ration, every careless act of plenty. Some resisted the shift. Pride urged them to cling to the old narrative, to insist that this was all temporary, a mask hiding America's true weakness. They said the supplies would dry up, the kindness would sour, the illusion would crumble. But reality wore them down. Day after day, the abundance never faltered. Day after day, the guards behaved with ordinary fairness. The mask, if it was one, never slipped, and so the resistance thinned, leaving only quiet awe in its place. The camp economies grew elaborate. Cigarettes became wages, chocolate the rare currency of celebration. Men organized concerts, plays, small enterprises within the fences. They lived as prisoners, yes, but they also lived as witnesses to a society that seemed to overflow with resources. The fences themselves became less symbols of captivity than of separation from the greater mystery beyond. They looked past the barbed wire and wondered, if prisoners ate like this, how rich must ordinary Americans be? What unsettled them most was the ease of it all. Abundance did not seem forced. It did not appear as propaganda or as deliberate spectacle. It simply was. The guards did not distribute chocolate to impress them, nor cigarettes to manipulate them. These things flowed naturally, part of the machinery of a society vast enough to consider luxuries as basics. That naturalness was what eroded their old certainties. If America did not even notice its own wealth, then perhaps its strength was deeper than any enemy had imagined. One night, as the prisoners lay in their bunks, a storm rolled across the plains. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the ground, and rain lashed the barracks' roofs. The men huddled in their blankets, reminded of Europe's storms of fire. Yet here there were no bombs, no sirens, no terror. The storm passed, and in the morning the camp returned to its rhythms. Breakfast trays filled, cigarettes distributed, candy bars tossed out casually. The war felt far away, almost unreal. For men used to hunger and fear, the very distance of violence was as shocking as the abundance of food. The personal transformation was slow, almost invisible at first. A man who once refused to touch American goods found himself craving the taste of gum. Another, who had sworn never to smoke the enemy's tobacco, now bartered for more cigarettes. Habits changed, loyalties shifted quietly, not with betrayal but with recognition. They were still soldiers of Germany, but in their hearts they carried new questions. If their enemies lived like this, what kind of future awaited a defeated Germany? The camps became classrooms without teachers, each meal a lesson, each discarded cigarette a lecture. The men learned not through words but through sights, smells, tastes. Chocolate taught them that wealth could be sweet. Cigarettes taught them that luxury could be routine. Waste taught them that prosperity could be careless. And the guards taught them, through ordinary decency, that enemies could behave with fairness even in victory. The cumulative effect was devastating to the old worldview. By 1944, thousands of these men had settled into lives that felt more like strange exile than torment. They worked, they bartered, they wrote letters home. And they watched, always watched, the America around them. They saw not just plenty but the confidence of plenty, not just generosity but the power behind it. They began to sense that the war had already tipped, that Germany's promises of greatness could not compete with this reality. And in that realization, something shifted deep within them. Yet there was one more layer to unfold, one more truth hidden in the abundance. It was not only their stomachs and habits that changed. It was their belief. Slowly, quietly, without speeches or force, America's prosperity began to chip away at the foundations of their ideology. The men who had marched for a 1,000-year Reich now wondered if perhaps the future belonged not to force but to plenty, not to fear but to freedom. The thought was dangerous, fragile, and new. But it was there, whispered in bunks, mulled over in smoke, tasted in every square of chocolate. And still, they had not seen the greatest shock of all. For beyond the fences, beyond the rations and cigarettes, beyond even the laughter of guards, lay a revelation so profound it would haunt them long after they returned home. They had glimpsed prosperity, but they had not yet faced its true meaning. That reckoning waited just ahead, carried on the same ships that would one day carry them back to a Germany they could no longer recognize. Ships groaned in the harbors of 1945, their decks crowded with men who had once worn desert uniforms beneath Rommel's banner, now draped in the gray fatigue of prisoners bound for home. They carried little with them. Some carved trinkets made in camp workshops, some photographs of life behind the wire, some empty wrappers folded carefully like relic. The chocolate was gone, the cigarettes smoked, but the memory clung with more weight than rifles once had. Each man had been remade, not by the lash of cruelty but by the bewildering generosity of their captors. And as the ships cut eastward across the Atlantic, they knew they were sailing not just back to a broken Germany, but into the jaws of disillusionment. The docks they returned to were not the Germany they remembered. Cities lay in ruin, smoldering like the carcass of a burned forest. Bridges hung twisted across rivers, trains no longer ran with precision, and streets once lined with bakeries and cafes were choked with rubble. They stepped onto soil that no longer smelled of bread and coal smoke, but of dust, ash, and fear. Women picked through ruins with baskets, children lined up with tin pails at soup kitchens, and the faces of civilians bore the hollow look of famine. In that moment, the prisoners knew the truth. The Reich that had promised glory had delivered only ruin. The empire that was supposed to last 1,000 years had withered in less than 20. Yet in their pockets and in their minds, these men carried something fragile, almost forbidden, souvenirs of freedom. Empty Lucky Strike packs, flattened Hershey wrappers, the memory of chewing gum's artificial sweetness, the sound of swing music drifting over camp fences. To their families, these tokens seemed like miracles, or perhaps cruel jokes. Mothers wept at the sight of an empty candy wrapper, not for its sweetness, but for what it symbolized, a world where even enemies ate better than German children. Fathers held cigarette packs as if they were evidence of another planet. The disbelief was palpable. Impossible, they whispered. Propaganda. But the men insisted it was real. They had lived it. The conflict within each returning prisoner was sharp and private. How could they speak of America without betraying their homeland? How could they describe a place where abundance was ordinary while their neighbors starved? Some stayed silent, ashamed of their envy, unwilling to feed accusations that captivity had softened them. Others spoke carefully, framing their stories as curiosities rather than revelations. A few, braver than most, told the truth bluntly. They had tasted freedom, and it was sweet. That truth did not always find welcome ears. Some called them liars. Some called them traitors. But the seed was planted, and once planted, it grew. The sweetness of freedom lingered in memory more vividly than gunfire or desert heat. A man would recall unwrapping a chocolate bar under the Tennessee sun, its surface softening, the taste exploding across his tongue, and he would remember that moment more sharply than the clatter of tanks. Another would recall the simple act of lighting a cigarette, inhaling smoke he knew was plentiful, and feeling wealth in his lungs. These were not trivialities. They were symbols, shorthand for a new world he had glimpsed. For men who had been taught that fear and obedience were the highest virtues, the experience of casual kindness and careless wealth was transformative. The ashes of empire lay everywhere. Factories bombed to skeletons, railroads splintered, fields untended. The Reich had demanded sacrifice and delivered starvation. The Führer had promised victory and delivered rubble. But across the ocean, prisoners had seen a different model of strength, not forged in terror, but in abundance. They had seen guards toss away half-smoked cigarettes, children eat candy every day, and a society so confident it could feed its enemies better than Germany fed its citizens. That contrast burned in their minds, a silent indictment of everything they had once believed. Some men carried that memory into politics, into classrooms, into families. They became advocates for democracy, for rebuilding Germany along the lines of what they had witnessed. They remembered that America's power was not only in weapons but in refrigerators, in radios, in supermarkets, in the ordinary luxuries that gave dignity to life. Others carried it quietly, a secret envy, a wistful longing each time they tasted meager bread or smoked a cheap, black-market cigarette. In both cases, the lesson endured. Prosperity was its own kind of weapon, one no army could match. The climax of this transformation was not a single battle or speech, but a realization that arrived slowly, like dawn after a long night. The empire was gone, its ashes scattered across a ruined continent. In its place rose the faint possibility of something new, informed not by fear but by the memory of chocolate and cigarettes. The men who had once been enemies had become witnesses to a society that revealed its strength not through cruelty, but through casual generosity. They carried that witness back to a broken land, where it became part of the soil from which a new Germany would one day grow. The ships that bore them home did more than ferry bodies. They carried invisible cargo, memories of sweetness, symbols of plenty, the smoke of freedom curling in every exhalation. And as the men stepped into the ruins, they could not shake the feeling that history itself had handed them a riddle. The Reich had demanded loyalty in hunger. America had offered abundance in captivity. Which, in the end, had proved stronger? The answer lay not in speeches or ideology, but in the quiet power of a candy bar melting in a prisoner's hand. For many, that was the most haunting truth of all, that their defeat had not only been written in battlefields and bombings, but in the casual luxuries of their captors. The ashes of empire were bitter. The sweetness of freedom was unforgettable. And deep in their hearts, they knew that the taste of that sweetness would shape them, and the world they returned to, long after the war had ended. And yet, even as they stepped into the ruins, another realization loomed, a final twist of irony, more profound than chocolate or cigarettes. They had witnessed prosperity from behind fences, but they had not yet reckoned with the force that made it possible. For beneath the sweetness lay an industrial engine vast enough to change the course of history, and that engine was still only beginning to reveal its power.